All right, here we go. Today is Sunday, May 27th, 2018, and this is episode 218 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry, and I'm not sure I still remember how to do this.
It has been an incredibly long time.
I know. I bet people have given us up for dead.
And by the way, I do apologize. It's mostly been my fault, not entirely, but mostly. And a lot of it, by the way, is I had fully intended to record over the past couple of weeks and make announcements about the impending implementation date of the GDPR, which is now a couple of days behind us. But honestly, that's kept me and the rest of the civilized world in IT, I think, pretty busy.
Speaking of GDPR, do we have a current casualty count?
No, there's apparently shortly after it went into effect, a lawyer named Max Schrems from Austria, who's a pretty well-known privacy activist, filed suit against Google and Facebook on a whole bunch of different counts. But that's really early days. So,
is there like an ETF I can get in on for those kind of lawsuits?
I've been wondering if there's a way to play arbitrage against European bonds.
I gotta wonder
something.
I gotta wonder why we can't crowdsource legal efforts yet for class action legal effort crowdsourcing. Maybe we can, and I just don't know it.
I suspect we can.
There's probably violating some ethics rules there, but
I would also think so too. Yes.
But I mean, it is amazing watching all the different companies sort of respond to GDPR. I think somebody posted, and I forget who, and I apologize, I should give them credit, looking at a particular newspaper site for North America and then for Europe. And when they stripped out all the tracking and ads and everything else, it dropped the size of the web page by like 90%.
Yeah, it went from like 5.5 megabytes to like 500 kilobytes and loaded like 10 times faster. So, and also there, some other bit of news was that on Friday, the 25th, when the law went into effect, people were posting screenshots of different websites that were basically blocking European IP addresses. So, and that was apparently a fairly common thing for a number of different U.S.-based news sites. I think the LA Times was one, and there are a whole bunch of others. Basically saying, notice you're in the EU. We're not ready for you yet. Come back later.
So as a way to comply with the law, they just took themselves out of the market.
Yeah. Which in a way, you would say, if you're the LA Times, your target audience probably isn't in Europe anyway. But again, I think the core issue is that you've got a lot of web-based companies that don't have a way to monetize their business if they can't do the stuff that the GDPR is intended to prevent. So
yeah, I would say though, there's probably a decent chunk of their subscribers who are expats living overseas who want to keep an eye on their local newspaper to see what's going on.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I didn't think about that. You're right.
But either way, it will be interesting watching the fallout and the unintended consequences and the reverberations of GDPR as it gets started. And I think as we start to see some actions being taken by the regulators, we'll start to figure out what it really truly means.
Yeah.
For companies to comply.
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, as most people will point out, the May 25th was the beginning of the GDPR, not the end, right? That was the effective date. Now it goes forward. And by the way, if you haven't had enough fun with the GDPR, then you have any business dealings in Europe, you may want to take a look at the NIS directive because it's almost as fun as the GDPR, and in some cases has similar types of fines. So, yeah, there you go. All right. So, just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers. One thing I do want to say is thank you very much to our Patreon donors, especially during our recent drought. So, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you to our Patreon donors. You guys are awesome. Also, one other housekeeping note: we've switched audio software. We are trying out Zencaster for this show.
Yeah.
So, if things seem different, sound different, feel different, that's probably
correct. And it'll probably take us a show or two to iron out the wrinkles. So, thank you for being patient. All right, so getting into some stories. Obviously, some of these things are a little, probably a little dated by now, but I think they're still pretty important to cover. The first one comes from ZDNet here, and the title is, if I can get up to the top, WannaCry ransomware crisis 1 year on. Are we ready for the next global cyber attack? So it's hard to believe, but it's actually been almost 13 months ago that WannaCry hit, and we're actually really closely approaching the 1 year anniversary of NotPetya too. And as the anniversary has come up, there's been a whole lot of reflection on what's changed and what's not changed in the past year. And this is just one of the articles that you actually found in response to that. And I would say the headline or the common theme between these many of these articles is the underlying problems continue to exist, right? We
sure
probably have to some extent neutralized this specific thing, but even so, they as the article points out, there have been some recent fairly high profile examples of other companies recently being infected with WannaCry, which kind of tells you that it's not all it's not all roses, and which is not terribly surprising because even today we still see MS 08067 Conficker running around on networks, and that was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think some of the articles were talking about how there's still recent high level of activity going on with WannaCry, even to this day. So with this sort of underlying incredulous subtext of why can't we get this right, I think it just shows how difficult it can be to sometimes stomp out these vulnerabilities and patch. And we in the InfoSec community, I think, live in a bit of a bubble, a bit of an echo chamber of why can't you just patch and just patch it? Just we're hyper aware of this stuff, but I really do think there's a crap ton of corporate entity that just has a lot bigger problems to solve and aren't as worried about this as we are, and that's why we're going to continue to see stuff like this.
Yeah, and I suspect there's a very wide array of reasons why this sort of thing is happening. One is certainly reluctance to patch. I suspect others is people setting up, new systems that aren't patched, and that it's probably not that they're going about setting up new systems in the wrong way. They're not, they're not downloading, up to date images or what have you, and so we continue to see that those types of things happening. I'm not entirely sure that, especially in the aftermath of WannaCry, a lot of the systems that were going to get infected got infected, and so I kind of wonder how many of the new types of things are the new types of infections are the result of of newly set up systems. And I by the way, I have that same question about MS 08067 infections too. I'm highly skeptical that there's big piles of old systems sitting out there. I mean, in the tens of thousands of numbers, rather than new systems constantly being set up and taken offline and getting infected within the first couple of minutes of being connected to the internet.
So does that indicate our image build methodology is often incorrect? Our gold images aren't being
Absolutely.
updated, and whether it be a VMware image or a fresh load off a USB drive or even a
Absolutely.
CD.
Absolutely. And
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
think that's a really significant problem. And I think a lot of IT people don't appreciate how quickly something that is connected to the internet can be compromised. I think there's still a pervasive view that in the minds of many IT people, and I think this has gotten worse over the years. And NotPetya and WannaCry, I think, were wake up calls. I think there's this pervasive view that you had to be targeted, and so you had this, you have people in companies that appear to be benign or uninteresting, and people, IT people or business leaders are saying, who would want to attack us? And well, maybe no one would, but that's not. It doesn't require anybody to want to come after you. So I think there's a lot of different challenges. The other thing that struck me with WannaCry and NotPetya both was the large number of ways that any particular company could have avoided this. Like with WannaCry in particular, disabling SMBv1, which should have been disabled, long time ago. Um,
But it's clearly still heavily in effect. And, this goes to something we've talked about a lot, which is, if you're a big Windows shop, which many companies are, and you're a big enterprise and you've got, sysadmins running your AD forest, how much do they on a day-to-day basis get exposure or care or are driven through whatever sort of incentives to care about things like disabling SMB v1 over time? Let's say they set this up into the Windows 2003 days and they've just been slowly upgrading, and to go and do all the registry settings and the changes to disable SMB v1, it's entirely possible that they've never been exposed to that or don't even know to do that or never been asked to do that. It
Absolutely.
works. Why change it? And it's an
Yeah,
interesting
I
challenge.
think the other thing too is that as your environment grows, it becomes more and more complex, and the inertia, there's like this IT inertia. The inertia behind not making a change continues to grow. In order to do a competent job of testing, there's definitely, I don't know what the ratio is, right? But it's a nonlinear relationship between the complexity of turning off something like SMBv1, the larger your network and your environment gets. So, um,
Right. There might be something dependent on that for
yeah,
like some old
exactly,
application or whatever. And you may not know, or you may have uncertainty about what relies on it. You're more concerned about
exactly,
production
right,
disruption. So better just
right,
not to touch it.
right. So, and the other one that um, was concerning, and this we see in coming up in a lot of different contexts, and that is, we we've talked about this in the past. The whole point of least privilege, right? And we think about least privilege and often in terms of what level of access control do I have. We often think about that less so in terms of firewall rules. And when WannaCry hit, the and at NotPetya too, but with WannaCry in particular, it was thought at the time to be spread via phishing emails, and it turns out that it was actually being spread across the internet to systems that were exposed. Vulnerable Windows systems that were exposed had SMB ports exposed to the internet, and then were often reflection points into the corporate network. And the converse is also true. Systems on a corporate network almost never
Well,
should be able to talk SMB outside of your organization.
and we can sit here and say it's absolutely stunning and unbelievable that an unpatched Windows box or any Windows box has SMB ports open to the internet, but it's
Well, yeah,
clearly happening,
absolutely.
right? So, and we can sit in our Ivy Tower and go, that should never happen, but the reality is it does happen. It is happening, and we are sucking as an infosec profession at finding, advising, and corralling those boxes to
Correct.
stop that sort of
Correct.
thing.
I guess my point is, this WannaCry and not, we'll just focus on WannaCry, right? WannaCry wasn't a big story in the consumer space, right? I mean, these were enterprise companies being taken out in droves, companies that have, by and large, mature, experienced IT staff and infosec staff. So anyway, I think there's some sloppiness, and I suspect that the long period of time we had where we didn't have worms as a threat probably allowed us to get a little complacent. So
Alternately, we were focusing on different threats. If you look at it as a finite amount of energy you can put into securing your enterprise.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, but I would also say that that in isolation, the hygiene that allowed WannaCry to propagate is also reusable in many other types of attacks. I mean, if you read if you do any types of keeping up with modern techniques, like just as an example, it's pretty common technique or in vogue right now to try to capture Windows credentials. With the Windows bug du jour of trying to get people to click on a link and having the credentials sent across the internet. And so there's a lot of I think there's a lot of reasons why you want to adopt and embrace a set of best practices, and not simply because of something like this. I think this just took advantage of things that people should have already been doing. And I mean, I get your point. You're probably right. We have finite resources, and we're focusing on things that appeared to be the more important. But I mean, this is what we get when we do that, right?
But yeah, that in itself has an interesting effect. Now you come, I know we're kind of beating the story in the ground, but the basic hygiene stuff I think is still very, very relevant. And if we built our networks with the concept of breach and containment in mind, so we had good segmentation, we had good, limited reach of devices, we would stop more of these things from being able to spread just by the nature of modern design of security-minded networks. But it's incredibly difficult to retrofit that environment to an established enterprise. And that is the challenge, right? I think it's almost probably near impossible to rebuild a network in place with that kind of segmentation in mind, unless you're doing like a data center migration or you're migrating to the cloud, or some sort of event like that allows you to engineer your environment. Because it's just so expensive and disruption.
All right, well, let's move on to the next one, which is interesting because it kind of plays the other side a little bit. The title here is Enterprise Vulnerability Management as Effective as Random Chance. So this actually came up, I guess it was about a year and a half ago. I don't remember exactly when. It was one of not this most recent Verizon data breach report, but I think it was the one before or maybe two before. Anyway, the Kenna Security had, I think it was Kenna, If I'm wrong, I really apologize. But anyway, there was some at the time fairly controversial claims about uh, vulnerabilities that are exploited in attacks and whatnot. And so this is a kind of a similar play. So Kenna took a look at all of the CVEs that have been created since CVEs were being tracked up to now. There's 120,000. They subtracted out the ones that haven't actually been released yet. They came up with something in the 90,000 range. 90 looks like about 95,000. And they did some analytics and found a couple of interesting things. But I would say that the headline message is that the way most organizations approach prioritizing which patches they apply in terms of which things are the most important to patch first is in terms of preventing exploitation, which is after all why we generally patch. It's in their analysis as effective as random, as selecting patches at random to fix. And basically, so what they're really saying is that if you use the CVSS score and categories, vendor categories, as your markers to determine what you're going to, how you're going to prioritize your patches, you would be you would do an equally good job at preventing exploitation if you just ignored CVSS and categorization and randomly picked a vulnerability to go fix. Randomly assign priorities based on the available patches. That's kind of this. I would say that's the way it sums up to me.
Yeah, I'm really struggling with that concept. I've read it. I've read this article 2 or 3 times now. I understand what they're saying. I'm just really struggling with accepting it. It does not match up to
Well,
my version of reality.
yeah.
And so either they're looking at things that doesn't match up to my anecdotal evidence, or my anecdotal evidence has led me astray, or I have some sort of bias that has been built in over the years that you must patch vulnerabilities that have logos and theme songs and websites
well, I mean,
and
that is true
mascots
because
first. You have to.
your senior executives will demand it, of course.
Yeah, right. But in all honesty, right, I think most programs have this concept of, okay, if it's a CVSS score that is like 7.5 or above, it must be patched within some small number of days. Let's say 15 days. And then if it's 5 to 7.5, you got 30 days. And if it's 1 to 5, you got 60 days. Right? The concept is go after the most damaging ones first, like the ones that have remote code exploitation and that sort of thing. And this just throws that entire concept up in the air. Now, is that because we suck at it? And even though we have that intention and the concept is designed well, we implement it badly. Kind of like really good encryption that is implemented badly becomes bad encryption. Or are they just sort of trying to sell their gear
Well,
so they have a really interesting way of asking
I
these
would
questions?
say that all of the above is probably true to some extent. I mean, it clearly they're here because they're trying to sell something, and their claim to fame is machine learning stuff in the cloud and whatnot. But the thing that I found most interesting, and I actually see this when I've reflected on the kinds of vulnerabilities that have hit organizations we've talked about in the past, it kind of rings true. And so the way to think about it is like this. Number one, only a subset of vulnerabilities are ever exploited, right? And so
Yeah, Interestingly, the stat from their article is the vast majority of bugs, 77%, are never used in exploit, and only estimated
Correct.
2%
So that
are
means
utilized in cyber attacks.
if you are going after all of the high priority bugs first, let's just put them in high, medium, low category, right? You go after the high priority bugs first. You're only covering a percentage. A very small percentage of those are actually going to end up being used, and so that means a lot of that stuff is quote wasted effort, not but you don't know which one is going to be exploited, so it's not really wasted effort. But the point is that I think this is the real point. Lower severity vulnerabilities are also being exploited in a more rapid way, and so more rapid than our patching regimes often allow. And so there's this false sense of urgency that we assign to mediums and lows, where we kind of think that if it's a medium, well, it's harder to exploit, or the bad things that can happen are less severe, or what have you. But that's not necessarily the case, right? And I think that is it's not really clearly articulated in this article. And so I think that's one of the they could have done a better job here. But I think that's the key, is there's what they're really saying is that mediums and lows are also being exploited quickly, and we would be better off kind of putting them all into one big pot and drawing them out of a hat than our current approach, which puts high priority vulnerabilities being patched first, and medium second, and lows third, given that lows and mediums are also being exploited roughly as fast as highs.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think the other thing is that most folks don't take the CVS score and use it as intended, which is to modify the base score
Correct.
based on your environment and your situation. And most people just take the base score. So when you start by the way, very few people actually have time to do this, and you might actually read into this article that one of the things that Kenna does is automate that process for you, perhaps. Once you start modifying the base scores with your environmental scores, and I think there's like two other things that feed into it. Clearly, I don't do it because I don't know it off the top of my head. It can change the severity of the score for your environment, which should guide your patch,
I think the way urgency. I would say my probably misread of their intention is that they're trying to do some kind of natural language processing on the text of the advisories themselves to try to ferret out things like, is this something that could be wormable? How, is there something that makes this more likely to be exploited than something else, and so on? And that may be, not that may not come through with the CVSS, because the CVSS score doesn't really tell you, hey, it's already being exploited in the wild, right? It's just a number that tells you how how the severity of the thing. And so I think that's the
CVSS does leave some things to be desired, certainly.
Well, that's
better than nothing.
They're saying that it isn't.
The other thing that I know, and that's where I'm struggling. The other thing that occurs to me is if only 2% are used in wide-scale cyber attacks, 2% of vulnerabilities, and only 23% are ever used in any exploits, it would be interesting to see if we could predict those and use that as a prioritization.
Absolutely. And
I don't know how easy that would be.
I would say,
but it would be interesting
for me. I mean, this is just Jerry. When I am looking at, for instance, the monthly Microsoft vulnerabilities, Microsoft will release CVSS 10s, 10 patches all the time, but they're not all rated equal. And so the thing that I try to look at is to do some kind of an assessment to say, is this something that is likely to be wormable? And that kind of, in my mind, puts it towards the top of the pile. And that's a really blunt heuristic, and there's probably much better ways to do it and whatnot. I'm not saying that's a great beacon of light, but I think the point is, for a point of this article is, there's better ways to do this, especially when you consider that we do have limited time and resources, and we're ultimately patching stuff that's not being and not going to be exploited. Not that we don't ever want to patch it. In my mind, it is more likely that it would behoove us to find a more effective way to prioritize patches in a manner that helps actually prevent exploitation.
Yeah, it's a tough topic because if we shift our patching methodology, the bad guys might shift what they go after. So there's definitely some gaming here, right?
All right, so moving on to our next story, and the title here, it also comes from ZDNet. Title here is Open Source Vulnerabilities Plague Enterprise Codebase Systems. So interesting thing. There's a lot of people, and I see this happening see this view more and more in information security, or maybe it's just IT in general, that open source is better. Open source is more secure and whatnot. And I would say that in the circles that I run in, which is tends to be heavily regulated spaces, the kind of the opposite view is true.
We're going to get hate mail from Richard Stallman.
Probably true. And it's but it's a nuanced issue. It's not necessarily that open source software itself is more or less secure. It's really that its use is more or less secure, and I think that's what this particular article here is pointing out. So there's a company called, I can't tell exactly what the heck this company's name is. It's either Synopsys or Black Duck, or I don't really know. The report might be named Black Duck. Who really knows? Anyway, there's a company who commissioned a report.
When Jerry's tired and get ready to go on vacation, he's like, I don't know what the company name is.
Just for clarity, on Tuesday, Synopsys released the Black Duck by Synopsys. Okay. All right. I guess their name is Synopsys. Whatever.
Clearly, you've not spent time in marketing.
It's important
to market. Everything needs a name.
This is a pretty interesting analysis they did. Now, I think there's a really, and it's not stated in here, but I'm going to point it out. There's a really important bias that I'll mention in a second. So this company did an analysis of 1,000 different enterprise applications. Okay, and the bias is that they only analyzed things that I'm guessing they were asked to analyze, right? So conversely, there were probably stuff that they weren't asked to analyze because maybe they were worse. So, having that caveat in mind, we shall proceed. So of the 1,000 apps that they looked at, 96% had open source components, which is not surprising. Not surprising at all.
Which not that much 60%. Yeah, that's fairly common.
60% of those applications that had open source components had some vulnerability in the open source, right? So the open source components they were using in 60% of the cases had a vulnerability.
So are they implying at that point then that when companies start grabbing open source components, they don't look as carefully at the code bases for patching them and keeping them up to date. Like they sort of outsource the responsibility to
Having
fix
seen
that
this
software.
up close and dealt with a lot of third-party vendors, I actually think that is exactly what's happening. That companies will integrate a bunch of stuff. They'll write their own code. They'll integrate a bunch of open source stuff, and they'll release it. And that they may be on a yearly release cycle, or maybe they're never intending to produce an update because they've sunset that version and you got to go buy the next version. And in any event, the company, the manufacturer of the software is not staying on top of updates of the components, because that's it's a lot of work and to keep track of. So
And to be fair, most enterprise vulnerability management scanners don't
well,
dig that
right,
deep necessarily into the
right.
open source components. They may, well, I should put it, sometimes they will, but let me put it this way. Somebody asked me if my enterprise was using a common open source component
Yeah,
in commercial
think
software. I wouldn't have a good way of answering that question.
the answer to that question is that it depends, because it depends on the nature of the component and and how it presents itself in the application. Because we, just as an example, they talk a lot about the Apache Struts vulnerability, which was the apparent cause of the Equifax breach last year or the year before. And a lot of vulnerability scanners, especially in the early days, would detect it in applications, but it would only detect it if it was in the default location. And so, if as you are creating your own application and integrating Apache Struts, if you change the places, change the location of where Apache Struts lived, the scanner may or may not actually detect it. So that's one of the big challenges here, is that it's kind of you almost need like heuristic based scanners, vulnerability scanners, looking for evidence of a particular application regardless of where it may be sitting.
Right. If it isn't something common like a banner being displayed by an open
Exactly.
source web server component or something like that, yeah, makes it tough. Or do enterprise start demanding that their software vendors start disclosing every component that they license and use?
Yeah.
That's
So
just gets
moving
ugly.
on, it gets worse.
That's a scary, tough problem.
They've found an average of 64 vulnerabilities per application, which is mind-boggling. And by the way, I suspect, I don't know what the median is, right? So that's the average. That means that one could have 1,000 and the others could have just a couple. But we don't really know for sure. 54% of those vulnerabilities were rated critical, and 17% had a logo and a brand and a spokesperson. Yeah, right. And 33%
appearance agent
contain the same Apache Struts vulnerability as that which was used to attack Equifax.
Well, that's a great example. Your executives come back and say, "Do we have this component?" Well, I can identify it directly in certain circumstances, right, but I may not be able to identify it in others, which is scary.
The coup de grace, which is they did a breakdown of the applications by industry, and all of the IT related industries like cybersecurity and internet and mobile applications and internet and software infrastructure were the top offenders for the percent of code base with high security vulnerabilities, which is amazing.
Yes.
But I would say that this is something that we've talked about. I guess we've danced around a little bit. We've talked a lot about the the challenges and I think the growing concern around supply chain. It's security issues related to supply chain, and I think this is a good example of that. When we acquire applications, this is certainly something that we should be asking about. Okay, vendor, you're responsible for updating your code, but are you also committing to keep the open source components that you've integrated up to date? So that's a good question to ask. And then the other is when and by the way, there's really no, that at least that I could sense in here, there's no split of how many of these 1,000 applications were in-house written or commercial. I didn't get a view on that, but it certainly happens. And so just like software development companies or software vendors will use open source, it's very common for internal IT application development teams to integrate open source. And I think the very same problem happens. And you probably have more of an opportunity to control it when it's an internal development team. But that this is almost well, it's not almost, it is an inventory management problem, right? If your teams are integrating open source components, they should be keeping a record, and they should be treating those components as or managing them according to the vulnerability, your company's vulnerability management program.
That sounds like a lot more work. How does that fit into the Agile framework?
That's a great.
That sounds like something
I will
the
say,
Scrum Master should take care of. Next.
I actually think that Agile helps us out a lot in that, because previously the way. Yeah, and
next you're going to say you started doing CrossFit.
I'm going to be a pilot too someday, and I'm thinking about going vegan. Yep.
Hey, hey.
So anyway, where was I? Agile. Yes. So
you were saying Agile.
Most of us who've been around for a long time know the way. Yes. We're all pretty familiar with enterprisey internal applications following the waterfall methodology, where we would release something about every 7 years, or something like that. Agile, I think, gives an opportunity to actually have a hope and hell of addressing vulnerabilities in components in a much more realistic time interval. Because the whole concept of Agile is that you release small, frequent updates, and if you have that kind of
if you spend your development resources on addressing vulnerabilities as opposed to providing new features.
You're right.
Which is the fundamental challenge we all have. Where do you spend your time? This is what it keeps coming back to. It's a cultural challenge, not necessarily.
Correct, but I guess my point is, you're not. It's fundamental resource. No longer. You're not in a situation where you're kicking the can down the road till the next time you release a software or an application update, because in the old model that could be a year away.
Well, you have the opportunity.
That's true, but
I would. You're actually going to take it. Look, man, this feature. If we don't get this feature out, we're going to lose deals. We'll deal with your vulnerability later.
But I would also say that one of the other things that, and I've seen this make positive change. So I maybe am too optimistic, but I have seen good come of this. When you in the Agile world, you've got people touching the code base very commonly or very frequently, right? And so that in my experience, that didn't happen in the old world model of of waterfall. You may have years between people touching a certain part of the code base. And so, it's time to go upgrade Apache struts, and nobody wants to touch that because, it's been 5 years since, since Sally left, and Sally was the only one that knew how that worked. And so I think that's another potential advantage. But like everything else, if your company's not gonna commit to it, then whatever, it's not gonna help. But
Yeah, no, it's fair. So really, what we need is Agile for Active Directory management, and then we'd solve all the problems for you.
yes, yes, that's exactly right. Yes. All right, our last story. Bring us home here from
All
Data
right.
Breach Today. Title is Nuance Communication Breach Affected 45,000 Patients. Yes, this is the same Nuance Communication that suffered $92 million in losses as a result of NotPetya last year. They're back at it again. Apparently, they had 46 or 45,000 improper disclosure of 45,000 records, and so just for those who are uninitiated, right? The part of the business that got breached is doing transcription services for medical practices. So these are actually medical records, which fall under the HIPAA regulation here in the U.S. So not a great look. Apparently, it was a former employee who, quote, hacked into their system and improperly accessed 45,000 patient records. Yeah, which is pretty amazing. Now they don't go on to say exactly how this person did it, but I think that since this is going to, I believe it's going to be a criminal case, so we'll probably hear more about the the charges or the alleged attack. But it sounds to me, if I read between the lines, it sounds to me like this person retained some level of access to the system, and after he was no longer employed, and that was how it happened. So yet again, we've seen this quite a few times, and I know I've talked with lots of people who, one of the one of the really interesting things about running the show is I get lots of people wanting to share war stories, and I hear a lot of stories about organizations having data breaches, most commonly not reported, um, that result from not deactivating IDs when people leave. Just turn them off. Turn them off.
Just turn them off, people. Just turn
Not
them
hard.
off.
It's not hard. I'm just saying. It's not hard.
But apparently it is.
Do it. Disable. If you don't have to delete it, you don't have to delete it. Change the password, right? To something that the person doesn't know. If you're super afraid that deleting the account is going to break something, change the password.
Well, I think sometimes they don't even know where all the accounts are active.
Seems like Active Directory should be able to help with that, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But we
yeah, yes, that's what we're going to start calling it. Yes.
Don't you mean Agile
Directory? We're, you know what? Next year they're gonna rename it. I bet. No,
and we're not going to get a any
anyway,
credit for it or make any
so
money
in the article they talk about how at some point in the future machine learning will save the day on this problem. I don't know how, but in the meantime, deactivate your terminated employees. And if you don't know all the accounts they had, well, you probably have another problem that you need to go solve too. So
which gets even more interesting when you start doing a bunch of cloud stuff.
Correct.
Because then you probably don't have
Correct.
one federated directory.
And that, by the way, is pretty
unless
scary,
you
you know,
think to set
because
that up.
now they're, you know, you used to live in a world where you could turn off the, you know, access at the firewall or the VPN concentrator and have some reasonable assurance that they would, you know, a terminated employee wouldn't be able to get in, but that's not true any longer. So, you know, moving to the cloud has some responsibilities to come along with it, and that's one of them. So, anyway, that is the show for this week. I'm going to be in lovely Honolulu next weekend, so hopefully we can work something out to record again.
Yeah, and just a special note, tomorrow in the United States is Memorial Day, which is the day we set aside to honor those who have sacrificed themselves in the armed services and been killed in line of duty. So it's not appropriate to say Happy Memorial Day. It's more appropriate to say this is the day we honor our fallen soldiers. So hopefully, if you hear this show in any reasonable time, thank you to those who have sacrificed and their families. And we save the Veterans Day for thanking our current veterans.
I second that. So thank you.
I have to say on that.
And I guess, you know, it would really be to the families at this point. So, right. I know.
Indeed. But on to happier notes, you're off on vacation. So enjoy the currently smoldering Hawaii and its lava flows aplenty. Which actually I think will be pretty interesting to see. I think if you can get near it,
but
you might see a pretty.
It's been a little frustrating because I have all my life wanted to go to Volcano National Park, and now it is closed. And the second thing I wanted to go to was to see the USS Alabama, and I just found out today that it, in fact, is closed indefinitely. So, yes.
So you are having your own National Lampoon's vacation. And you're going to have to go get a pellet gun.
That's right.
You're going to have to go get a pellet gun and force John Candy to give you a tour.
Yes. Go
for most young people in the audience, go rent it.
All right. With that, we will talk again next time, hopefully next week. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.